The guns just stopped. Can you imagine it? No artillery, no drones buzzing overhead, no wailing sirens, just a profound, unsettling silence. And that silence, my friends, is now the most dangerous sound on Earth. Washington wakes up to a paradox. The shooting war, the one everyone watched unfold on their screens, is over. But the political war for Europe's very future, that's just getting started. Ukraine desperately wants its land back, every last inch. Russia, on the other hand, wants those crippling sanctions gone yesterday. NATO? They're clamoring for ironclad guarantees, and the US has maybe 48 hours before this incredibly fragile ceasefire starts to crack wide open. What happens next isn't peace, not in the way we usually think of it. Oh no, it's a high-stakes, nerve-wracking chess match played out on a board absolutely covered in live explosives. Welcome to the day after. So, first problem on the president's desk, the one that's guaranteed to cause instant headaches. Who actually owns what? Roughly 17% of Ukraine, and we're talking about massive chunks, including Crimea and large swaths of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, is still firmly under Russian occupation. Ukraine, quite understandably, says the restoration of its 1991 borders is non-negotiable. That's their red line. Moscow, however, just shrugs, claiming it annexed 4 regions last year and isn't about to deoccupy what it now calls its own sovereign soil. Picture this, a peace deal that leaves those areas in some kind of messy limbo. What do you get? The next Nagorno-Karabakh, a frozen conflict just waiting to reignite at the slightest spark. It's a ticking time bomb. Washington's move here is to push for an interim security demarcation line, something that keeps Russian troops frozen in place while UN-administered referenda are supposedly prepared. Except, Kyiv absolutely insists that no legitimate vote can occur at gunpoint. And they're right, aren't they? The clock is ticking loudly. Every single day that the front line remains unresolved, ultra-nationalist factions on both sides feed on grievance, growing stronger, more vocal, and the probability of a spoiler attack, something that completely derails everything, just climbs higher and higher. US diplomats are quietly floating the idea of a Korean-style armistice, technically a ceasefire, not a full-blown treaty, buying maybe 5 years to negotiate a final status. Critics naturally are screaming appeasement, but realists? They're calling it breathing room, a chance to simply exist without constant shelling. Either way, nearly 3 million displaced civilians aren't looking for a punt. They're desperate for a verdict, for a home. Hold on a second, because the end of open warfare doesn't magically mean the end of insecurity, it just rebrands it, gives it a new, more insidious name. NATO's eastern flank, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, immediately starts asking the uncomfortable question, if Russia gets to keep even a tiny slice of Ukraine, who's next? They're not just asking for thoughts and prayers, they want US troops, Patriot missile batteries, and permanent bases, and they wanted them yesterday. Meanwhile, you've got Hungary and Turkey signaling loudly that they'll veto any fast-track NATO expansion for Ukraine. Why? They're terrified of immediate Article 5 obligations over hotly contested turf, fearing it would drag the entire alliance into a direct conflict. It's a real catch-22. Washington's trying to counter this with a hybrid package, a coalition of the willing outside of formal NATO structures. This would station American, British, and French forces in western and central Ukraine, armed with a discreet but utterly unmistakable nuclear umbrella. Think of it as a 21st century answer to West Germany's 1955 entry into NATO, security integration without the full membership headache. The catch, and there's always a catch, right? Congress has to greenlight a brand new security treaty that looks suspiciously like an alliance commitment, even if it doesn't have the official treaty name. Capitol Hill hawks, bless their hearts, love the deterrence angle. But deficit hawks? They absolutely hate the estimated $28 billion annual price tag. If the White House can't sell this at home, NATO unity fractures, giving Moscow all the space it needs to play divide and conquer in Brussels. Some European leaders, wary of direct confrontation, might even quietly start exploring alternatives, creating even more cracks in the alliance structure. Let's talk money, or rather, the lack thereof. Russia's economy shrank 3.1% last year. Inflation is stubbornly hovering near 12%. And the ruble? Well, it's the worst-performing emerging market currency you can't even trade because of capital controls. And yet, an eye-watering $350 billion in frozen central bank reserves are still sitting pretty in Western banks. Plus, Europe, in a bizarre twist, keeps buying sanctioned LNG through a maze of third-country shell games. Ending the war tomorrow would trigger a global chorus, especially from economic giants like China and India. demanding that those assets be unfrozen. Washington's strategy? A phased release tightly tied to verifiable troop withdrawals. Think of it kind of like an escrow account. For every kilometer Russia pulls back, $10 billion gets unlocked. European powers, desperate for stable energy, want the energy sanctions loosened first, but the US Treasury, they're insisting on keeping the oil price cap and the high-tech blockade firmly in place. Why? Because microchips and ball bearings are the choke points, the crucial weak links that prevent Russia from rearming its military machine. If Moscow balks, secondary sanctions would slam any bank foolish enough to try clearing dollars for Russian commodities. Wall Street fears a bond market tantrum, while farmers in Iowa are already worrying about fertilizer prices doubling again. The administration's line is clear: sanctions aren't just punishment, they're leverage. But leverage, as we all know, cuts both ways. Every month they stay in place, Global South resentment grows, making BRICS talks of a non-dollar payment system sound less theoretical and a lot more urgent. The global financial architecture itself hangs in the balance. Alright, let's zoom into Moscow for a moment. How do they spin this? The Kremlin sells the ceasefire at home as a temporary strategic pause, definitely not a defeat. State TV conveniently blames fifth columnists for the stalled campaign, while the security services are quietly purging hawkish bloggers who dared to demand total mobilization. But the reality on the ground is grim. Shortages, rising mortality rates, and a brain drain of at least 800,000 mostly young professionals have already hollowed out the economy and society. History offers a chilling lesson. Defeated empires don't always become docile. Sometimes they just incubate the next revanchist wave, a thirst for revenge that burns for decades. Think Weimar Germany, but with twice the landmass and, oh yeah, nuclear warheads. Washington's absolute nightmare scenario, a post-Putin power struggle where various factions, from hardline nationalists to more pragmatic elements, compete to prove who can be the most virulently anti-American. The smarter play, say the NSC planners, is to keep communication lines open, even if it feels like talking to a brick wall. Why? So that Russian moderates, and yes, believe it or not, they do exist, can signal that reintegration into global markets is genuinely possible after a genuine détente. Meantime, the US is quietly expanding Radio Free Europe budgets and cyber capacity, trying to keep information flowing past Moscow's increasingly sophisticated firewalls. Bottom line, a fragile peace is undeniably better than a hot war, but a humiliated Russia is still a nuclear Russia, and grievance, my friends, is a long-term fuel source for future conflict. Now, let's shift gears to Ukraine, a country that needs at least $750 billion just to rebuild bridges, power plants, and homes. The EU Commission is proposing something audacious: seizing those frozen Russian sovereign assets, that $300 billion we talked about, to seed a massive reconstruction fund. Lawyers in The Hague, however, are raising eyebrows, calling that state-level asset forfeiture, a legal concept largely untested under international law. Washington, ever pragmatic, backs the plan, provided a hefty 60% of that money flows through U.S. construction and energy companies. American firms, unsurprisingly, see opportunity shining like gold. Bechtel for ports, General Electric for turbines, Starlink for digital infrastructure. But speed here matters more than almost anything else. Every winter that Kiev can't restore basic heat and power drives another wave of desperate refugees, and refugee fatigue in Poland and Germany fuels the rise of far-right parties who threaten to shatter EU consensus on Ukraine aid. So, expect a sequel to the 2022 Lugano conference, probably dubbed Rebuild Ukraine 2025, sponsored in, say, Chicago. It'll be a grand affair where hedge fund managers mingle with grain exporters and defense contractors, all vying for a piece of the pie. The moral of the story is stark. Peace ends the dying, yes, but it immediately starts the bidding war for contracts. And whoever pays for the cement, well, they end up writing a significant part of the security rules for the future. This won't be a quick Marshall Plan. It's a long, complex slog, fraught with financial and political maneuvering. Back home, in the good old US of A, polls show 54% of Americans want to limit further Ukraine spending, only 37% still back as much as it takes. House appropriators are staring down a supplemental request topping $60 billion, and an election year looms large on the horizon. The administration's pitch? Rebuild Ukraine using seized Russian money, keeping taxpayer costs low. Opponents, predictably, are already calling it nation-building on the Dnieper, a phrase designed to conjure up images of past, expensive foreign entanglements. Senate hawks, never ones to miss an opportunity, will attach amendments demanding an automatic snapback of sanctions if Russia dares to reinvade. Meanwhile, the dovish wings want sunset clauses, ensuring any new commitments have an expiration date. Oh, and here's a fun fact. U.S. stockpiles of 155mm shells are down to a 3-month supply, and Raytheon can't ramp up Patriot missile production without multi-year procurement guarantees. Translation: even if peace breaks out tomorrow, the U.S. defense industrial base stays on wartime footing, because true deterrence requires a massive surplus, not just barely enough. If Congress balks, European allies will quietly dust off draft plans for an EU-only defense fund, something that would have sounded like pure science fiction just back in 2021. Look, no plan ever truly survives contact with reality, right? So let's list the jokers in this incredibly complicated deck. First, Ukrainian politics. President Zelensky's term technically expired in May. Elections are currently on hold under martial law. A ceasefire instantly revives the question. Does he call a snap vote to renew his mandate? Or does he rule by decree and risk igniting serious internal dissent? It's a brutal choice. Second, Belarus. Lukashenko's army never fully joined the fight, thankfully, but Russian troops are still stationed there. If Moscow decides to park tactical nukes in Minsk to save face, NATO's Article 5 tripwire suddenly moves 500 kilometers north, drastically shortening response times and raising the stakes exponentially. Third, China. Xi Jinping is eyeing a mediation role, dangling a tempting $200 billion in renminbi-denominated loans to Kiev and Moscow. What's his price? Belt and Road contracts, of course. Washington's fear isn't Chinese troops on the ground, but Chinese creditors shaping the very terms of peace, leveraging debt for geopolitical influence. Fourth, climate. Imagine a colder-than-average winter spiking global LNG prices, squeezing Europe just as sanctions fatigue reaches its peak. Energy security could once again trump geopolitical solidarity. Any one of these variables, all swirling beneath the surface, could flip this entire script before Inauguration Day, sending everything we've discussed spiraling into chaos. Real talk for a moment. No one, absolutely no one, gets everything they want here. Ukraine might recover most of its territory, but perhaps not Crimea. Russia might keep Crimea, but face permanent, debilitating sanctions. NATO might expand its influence without expanding its formal borders. The US might foot a significant portion of the security bill, but gain a generation of crucial European goodwill, and let's be honest, arms sales. So, what's the least bad package we can hope for? Probably a Korea-style armistice, freezing the conflict, a phased sanctions release, meticulously tied to verifiable Russian force levels, a robust coalition of the willing security guarantee for Ukraine, backed by powerful nations, and a Marshall-style reconstruction fund capitalized by those frozen Russian assets. Imperfect? Absolutely. Messy? You bet your bottom dollar. But is it preferable to a forever war that's currently killing 200 people a day? Mathematically, yes. The real victory condition here isn't some grand ideological triumph. It's far more administrative, far more pragmatic. Create a situation messy enough that nobody on either side wants to restart the shooting, but stable enough that farmers can plant their fields and kids can safely attend school. That, my friends, is as good as geopolitics gets in 2025. So, if the Russia-Ukraine war ends tomorrow, the bombs stop, but the brinkmanship, oh, that doesn't, it just moves. It shifts from ravaged battlefields to hushed conference rooms in Geneva, Riyadh, and maybe, just maybe, a Chicago Sheraton ballroom. Territory, NATO unity, the future of sanctions, and a bruised, resentful Russia still armed with nuclear weapons, all these sit on the negotiating table like loaded revolvers. The United States, as always, gets the bill, the headache, and crucially, the steering wheel. Handle it well, navigate these treacherous waters deftly, and Washington could cement another half-century of transatlantic leadership, guiding a more secure, if still complex, Europe. But fumble it, make a misstep, and Europe will rewrite its security playbook without you, charting a new course that might not align with American interests. Which outcome feels more likely to you? And what single factor, if anything, do you think would completely flip this board? Tell me below. The comment section is open and the clock on that fragile silence is already ticking.